Damas y caballeros, la ponencia plenaria del señor Ashish Kothari comenzará en 4 minutos. Por favor, mantengan sus pantallas prendidas durante la sesión y tengan en mente que en esta ponencia no se ofrece el servicio de interpretación de inglés al español. Ladies and gentlemen, the keynote speech of Mr. Ashish Kothari will begin in 4 minutes. There will be no interpretation from English to Spanish, so please bear in mind that you will have to hear it. The whole session will be given in English, and you will have to hear it in English. Please have your Zoom screens on while the keynote speech is being given. Thank you. Good day, Mr. Ashish Kothari. Can you hear me?
Hello, good morning.
Hello, good morning. We can hear you well. We will begin your session, your keynote speech in 3 minutes. Please stand by.
Okay. Can I
just
test my share screen? Yeah. It needs to be enabled.
Yes, you can give your, you will give your keynote speech in English. We will hear it just as it is. There will be no questions afterwards, as it is a keynote speech. So I would also like to let you know how it's going to proceed ahead. First, I will introduce you both in English and Spanish, and then you will begin your keynote speech. And then when you finish your keynote speech, I will give my closing comments, and that'll be, we will call it a day. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. But can somebody enable my screen sharing, because it's disabled right now? I can't share my screen.
Yes, hold on. 지금 기조 연설자가 화면 공유가 안 되니 화면 공유 권한을 양도해달라고 이제 연설을 하면서 아마 화면 공유를 하려고 하는 모양입니다. 네. I've delivered your request to our technicians. Let us know if you are now able to share your screen with.
Yes. Can you see if it's visible?
Yes, we can see it well. Thank you.
And the slides are changing, right?
Yes. The slides are changing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And I have 20 minutes, you said?
Yes, your keynote speech is scheduled to be from 20 minutes minimum to 40 minutes maximum. So please feel free to give your speech for as long as you want, but the time limit is 40 minutes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay. Damas y caballeros, ahora comenzaremos la ponencia plenaria del señor Ashish Kothari. Primero voy a introducirles al señor Ashish Kothari en inglés y luego en español. Mr. Ashish Kothari is an Indian environmentalist working on development, environment interface, biodiversity policy, and alternatives. He is one of the founders of Kalpavriksh, a non-profit organization in India which deals with environmental and development issues. Mr. Kothari has also been a teacher of environment at the Indian Institute of Public Administration in New Delhi, and has also been a guest faculty at several universities and institutes in the US. He has also worked as a member of several committees of the Government of India and coordinated the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan process in India, commissioned by the Government of India. He's currently coordinating the Bikap Sangram, which means Alternative Confluence process, which provides a forum for organizations and individuals working on development alternatives across India. Mr. Kothari has been co-coordinator of the academic activist co-produced Knowledge for Environmental Justice Project, Radical Ecological Democracy, and the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. He's author, co-author, co-editor of Churning the Earth, Alternative Futures, and Pluribirth, a post-development dictionary. His keynote speech is titled Eco-swaraj, Radical Ecological Democracy. El señor Ashish Kothari es un ambientalista que trabaja en el desarrollo, la interrelación ambiental, las políticas de biodiversidad y alternativas. Él es uno de los fundadores de Kalpa Bridge, una organización sin ánimo de lucro en la India que se ocupa de los problemas del medio ambiente y desarrollo. Ha sido profesor de medio ambiente dictando en el Instituto de Administración Pública de India en New Delhi y de varios institutos e universidades estadounidenses. Fue miembro de varios comités para el gobierno de India y coordinó el Plan de Acción Nacional Estratégico de Biodiversidad para el gobierno de India. Actualmente coordina el proceso Bikap Sangram, que significa Alternative Confluence en inglés, que ofrece foros para individuos y organizaciones que trabajan en el campo de desarrollo alternativa en India. El señor Kothari ha sido el señor Kothari ha sido el co-coordinador del proyecto Academic Activist Co-Produced Knowledge for Environmental Justice, la democracia ecológica radical y el proceso Global Tapestry of Alternatives. También es autor, coautor, coeditor del Churning the Earth, Alternative Futures, and Pluribirth, a Post-Development Dictionary. El título de su ponencia plenaria es Ecoswaraj, Democracia Ecológica Radical. Lamentablemente no se ofrece servicio de interpretación del inglés al español para esta ponencia. Por favor, recíbanlo con un aplauso de bienvenida. 박수 부탁드립니다. Go ahead, Mr. Kothari.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to this Congress. I wish I was physically present with you to be able to deliver this address. But over the last, I think, year and a half, we have got used to staring at the screen rather than looking at each other physically. Thank you again for this invitation. I am going to show some slides. I want to talk about what here we call Ecoswaraj or radical ecological democracy, and I will explain that during the presentation. Basically, most of my presentation will be focusing on looking at not the crises so much, which we are all aware of, but much more on what are the sorts of pathways, strategies, visions that we can get out of the multiple crises that we are in. Just a little bit on the context, which, like I said, we're all familiar with, but it's always useful to remind ourselves what we find in not just in India, but across the world, and especially for the global South, that is the people who are the poorest or who are on the margins of society in many different ways, or those who are directly dependent on nature and natural resources for their livelihoods, like fishing communities, farmers, forest dwellers, indigenous peoples, etc. That the process of development has meant enormous amounts of violence. It is violence against nature, as you can see in this advertisement, where because an oil pipeline has to be laid, the forest is being ripped apart. It's also violence against cultures all across the world, where languages are being destroyed, people are being uprooted. Even just in India, for instance, 60 million people have been physically displaced, uprooted from their lands for so-called development projects like mining and dams and so on. But it is also a violence against each one of us individually for our well-being, psychologically, emotionally. because of the kind of devastation that we see around us. So in many of these ways, I call it a movement from livelihoods, which were occupations that were connected to the local ecosystems, to cultures, to society, to now deadlihoods, which are destroying those livelihoods and are creating jobs, which where for most of us, those jobs are extremely boring. They don't enable our creativity. They're just one link in a vast production chain. Like for most industrial workers, for instance, that's what life would be. We also see that during the COVID pandemic in the last 1.5 years, there are two broad trends that we've seen in society around the world. One is where governments are using this as an opportunity to become more, to concentrate power more in their own hands, or private corporations are using this as an opportunity to become even more profit making. We can see that figure on the top right hand side. And this is an old figure. By now, I think the profits that some billionaires have made during the pandemic must have crossed $1 trillion. So that is one trend. But there is another trend also, which is very positive, which is where people are expressing solidarity with each other. They're going out of their way to help those who need help during the pandemic, young people going to help older people, and so on. And it is this kind of expressions of solidarity and generosity and love that I find to be the elements of hope. And that's what I will focus on much more in the rest of my presentation. So I think that if we look at what are the kinds of, if we are searching for the kinds of alternatives to the currently dominant system of development, which itself is based on some structures such as capitalism, state domination, patriarchy, racism, and so on, then we have to really find pathways that are challenging those structures of inequality and oppression and are creating new or sustaining older forms which are much more equal and much more sustainable. So I think there are two kinds of alternatives. One is resistance, where people are saying, no, we don't accept this current system of destruction and inequality and so on. We will protest against it, we will resist it, we will stop it. This photograph that you see on the screen right now is an image from a demonstration that indigenous people in central India had taken up about 30 years back against two very large hydroelectricity projects. And they stopped those projects. And what they were arguing was not just that those projects would destroy our livelihoods because they will drown our villages, they will drown our forests, but also that we won't allow it because this river is not a source of electricity, it is our mother. And we won't allow our mother to be shackled or damned in the way that you want it. So you see in these resistance movements, different kinds of narratives coming out, which are very, very important, which show that there are alternative ways of looking at the world. And we see this happening in, of course, across the world in different kinds of resistance movements. Currently, the farmers' movement in India, for instance, which has been going on for the last 7 months, the anti-racism movements, the youth climate justice movements, the movements for peace in Burma, Myanmar, the movement for a new constitution in Chile, and many others across the world. But along with these movements of resistance, we know that we also need to create constructive alternatives for meeting people's needs for food, for water, for energy, for housing, for the basic needs, but also movements which create more equality, movements which create more justice. So over the last many years, we have been helping to document and to link up with such movements all over the world. This book, and I'll explain a little bit about the book at the end, has 100 examples of these from all over the world. And I don't have the time, of course, today to go into many of them, but I will try and give a glimpse of some of these alternatives from different parts of the world. So let me start with one from India, which I'm most familiar with, which is a movement over the last 25 years of what are called Dalit women farmers. Dalit is the so-called outcasts in India, the most marginalized, the most oppressed section of India's society. So these are from that Dalit caste. Then they are also women. So because it's a patriarchal society, they are also uh, on the margins of that. And they're very small farmers. They don't have very large amounts of land. From a situation of being very, having hunger, malnutrition, and many other problems, lack of access to health, education, etc., they have now moved in the last 30 years to a situation where they have brought back all their traditional varieties of seeds. They've shifted completely to organic farming. They've brought in their own traditional technologies, maybe using some modern ones also. They've got land rights for women, which is very unusual in India. They've created grain banks in every village so that everybody has access to, they can get free grains for sowing in their fields. And because of all of that, they have not just got full food security in their houses, but in fact what they call food sovereignty, which means complete control over everything to do with food, the land, the seeds, the water, the knowledge, which is required for growing and generating their food. And quite remarkably, during the COVID pandemic, not only were they not hungry at all as the economy was shut down, but in fact, they were providing food for relief for those families outside of their villages who did not have enough to eat. Let me go to the other end of the world. This is in Peru, in South America, where the Quechua indigenous people have created a similar kind of a system by controlling their entire, what they call biocultural landscape. This is the landscape in the Andes, the mountains of the Andes. And here, this is one of the areas where the potato comes from, that it originated here. And they are conserving and using more than 1,300 varieties of potato. And they have sustained their own traditional knowledge systems, again, built some elements from modern knowledge systems into it. And they've sustained their food security and food sovereignty all of this time. And they also were able to contribute to food relief efforts during the COVID pandemic in nearby Cusco town, to orphanages and widows and others who did not have enough food. Let's move to the center of these two, which is Western Central Asia. Now, this area of the border, between Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran is, as you know, one of the most war-torn, one of the most conflict-ridden areas of the world. This constant, and this is where, in fact, a lot of refugees have had to flee from here and try and go into Europe. Now, here in the middle of this area, the Kurdish ethnic community, which is quite large, 10 million people, are trying to create a very large region of peace and a region in which everybody is involved in decision making, and it is based on ecological principles and feminist principles. It's an ideology they call genealogy, which means jin, J-I-N, means women. And of course, with some degree of success, some degree of failure, but it's an amazing attempt at trying to change the nature of the whole region by creating this kind of a much more direct, women-based democracy, which also has ecological principles built into it. The last set of examples I'll give is from Europe. And this is for 3 or 4 examples. I'll very quickly talk about them. The one on the bottom right-hand side is a factory that in Greece, which has been taken over by the workers, and they control it, they run it in a completely democratic manner. Every worker is involved in decision-making about the factory, and every worker is paid exactly the same amount of money, wage, for 1 hour of work, regardless of the kind of work that is done. Now, that's a very revolutionary kind of thing, right? The one on the top right-hand side is a very interesting school, also in Greece, which is run on very cheap fees, very low fees, but with very high quality teaching. And they do this, they're able to do this because the surrounding community, including the parents of the children, help with running the school, teach some teaching, some administration, free of charge. They don't charge anything. And this is part of a system they call time banking, in which people give free services to the community. And in return, they will get free services from somebody else. So they reduce the need for money in their system. The bottom left-hand side is an example of a local community currency where a lot of the local exchanges are done using a money or a currency that they themselves have created called Beki. So they don't need to use the euro for a lot of this, which gives them a little bit of independence from the centralized control of euro by banks and the economic, the governments. And so, for instance, I can use this Beki currency to buy bread from a baker. The baker can use that currency to buy wheat from a farmer. The farmer can use the currency to go to a doctor and get services. The doctor can send his or her children to school and use Beki to pay the fees. So it localizes the exchange, it stimulates the local economy, and it creates a bit of independence from centralized money systems. The fourth example on the top left-hand side, Disgrasa, is what is called a social and solidarity center, where especially people who don't have adequate housing or food or other things are able to come, create social relationships, get much cheaper access to things like food. And this became very important in the pandemic when everything was shut down and they didn't have enough access to not just to food, but also to psychological support, health support, etc., which this center was able to provide. So these are all part of what is called the social and solidarity economy. This is very different from the capitalist economy that we otherwise are subject to. And lastly, in fact, in many cities in Europe especially, there is a movement called feminist municipalism or fearless cities, in which there is a much greater degree of local democracy in the neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are also able to take decisions on what should happen in their areas. It's not only the bureaucrats and politicians on top who take decisions, but also that they've created zones where refugees and migrants are able to live with dignity. They don't live in fear, unlike in many other parts of the European cities. Now, I'm going to try and put these examples. I could go on for hours giving many, many more examples, but I'll stop here with the examples. And I'll try and build this into a kind of a framework of transformation. What are the kind of visions for that these examples are telling us of how society can change? So I look at it in the way we kind of try to look at it is that we're looking at change and transformation in 5 aspects of life. One is political, so that's the radical democracy on the top right-hand side. One is economic, then there's social, there's cultural, and there's ecological. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on every one of these, but let me give a little bit of an idea of the kinds of transformations. So when we look at radical politics, for instance, what many of the examples that I spoke about are talking is that we should be at the center of decision making. Going to elections is only one aspect of democracy, and it's not even the most important. The most important aspect of democracy is that power is in our hands. Whether I'm a villager or a citizen in a city, or a teacher or a student or whatever I am, in my institution, in my collective, in my neighborhood, in my village, I will be at the center of decision making, and I will do it with the whole community. So in India, for instance, one of the villages has this slogan that we elect the government in New Delhi, but in our village, we are the government. So it's flipping over the current power dynamics, where unfortunately power is only in Seoul or New Delhi or Washington or wherever, where they're saying, no, power should lie where we are. That's inherent in us, that we are born with that power. And there are many different ways in which this is done. people's assemblies, referendums, local decision making, etc. But it's important that this goes hand in hand with control over the economy also, because without that, you will have having political power without economic power is not enough. So the movements are also saying that we also need to democratize the economy, which means that those who are working and producing, industrial workers, farmers, fishing communities, craftspersons, whatever we are doing the work, the actual workers are the ones who should control the means of production. Why should capitalists own it? Why should the government own it? It should be owned by and collectively owned by workers. So for instance, the factory that I talked about in Greece, or workers' cooperatives, or producer companies, there are hundreds of thousands of different kinds of examples of where people are attempting to do this. But the second element of this democratization of the economy is to localize and be self-reliant for basic needs. Now, if for my water needs, I'm dependent on somebody 500 kilometers away, I become very vulnerable. And we saw this during the COVID pandemic, that long distance exchanges were no longer possible. So if I was dependent for my basic needs, for livelihoods, for living on, I was suffering quite a lot. So how does one localize exchanges? How do you create more self-reliance for things like water and energy and housing and so on? And it can be done, as we are seeing in many parts of the world. Finally, as part of this democratization of the economy, we also have to fundamentally question the indicators that we use for judging whether a society is progressing or not. Unfortunately, over the last 75, 80 years, we have thought of only GDP, gross domestic product, or economic growth rates, or things like per capita income as being the indicators of whether a society is progressed or not. So Korea is supposed to be much more developed, say, than India, based on these sorts of indicators. But if you actually were looking at things like happiness, satisfaction, good social relationships, access to clean air and clean water, having nature around us to enjoy, having good possibilities for learning, health, us being healthy, etc., then GDP makes no sense at all. It's absolutely nonsensical indicator for thinking about progress. So we need to go beyond GDP and think about what are the indicators of well-being, especially qualitative indicators, which tell us whether a society is really doing well or not. The next part of this, of course, is also struggles for social justice. We have many traditional forms of inequality. We have many new forms of inequality. For instance, one of the new forms of inequality is digital inequality. Some people have all the access to the digital world. Many people don't have. And so that creates a new kind of a division. There are old divisions like between men and women, or different genders in India, castes, racism, etc. So the struggles against those for greater equality are also part of this transformation. And the fourth crucial element here would be cultural. Now, unfortunately, in the last few hundred years, because of colonialism, and even after most countries have gained independence, there is still a colonial mentality that, for instance, English is the language to learn, or that modern science and technology are the only relevant forms of knowledge. So we are forgetting the fact that the world has got incredible amounts of diversity, cultural, language, food, ways of dreaming, ways of knowing, ways of being, like I said, and also multiple forms of knowledge, many of which are as relevant as any other. As an example, children in the islands in India can identify maybe 100, 200 species of fish without ever having done biology. So when they teach biology, sometimes they in fact lose that knowledge. When local languages are destroyed because they are imposed on top from on top by dominant languages, then you're also losing that memory and that knowledge. So how do you decolonize? How do you unlearn these kinds of approaches so that in fact we are able to respect and sustain the diversity of culture and knowledge, and that knowledge remains in the commons. Instead of being privatized, instead of intellectual property rights, copyright, etc., how can knowledge remain in the open, in commons? Everybody has access to it rather than my controlling it so that I can make more and more and more money. And finally, as part of this transformation is rebuilding our relationship with the rest of nature. Now, the image on the left-hand side is what modern science and technology or modern society tells us, that human beings are at the top of the evolutionary pyramid. And so we are masters of the universe and we can do what we want. And unfortunately, we have seen the results of that across the world. The one on the right and the image on the right-hand side is how indigenous peoples or local communities have looked at it for thousands of years, that we are one out of many, many, many species and a lot of life around us. And all of that life is worthy of respect. So we have to be humble in the face of the rest of nature. We have to reintegrate, reinsert ourselves within nature. And that would also significantly alter our pathways of development and the way we treat the earth. Now, at this core, if just to go back to this flower of transformation, at the core of it is a set of ethical values, principles. Yeah? And I'll just talk about that quickly, because I think what's important is that we don't replicate examples, we don't copy examples of solutions from one part of the world to the other, nor do we upscale that something is successful, so you keep making it bigger and bigger and bigger. But we do what I call outscaling, which means you learn from each other and you create your own solutions based on that learning. Now, what is the learning? The most important part of that is a set of values or principles or ethics. Let me, obviously we don't have time for me to go into all of these, but let me take a look at, I've already mentioned self-reliance for basic needs as one of the principles. Self-governance, autonomy, direct democracy as another principle. Cooperation. Now, if you look at our schools, children are always taught that competition is the most important thing. I have to come first in class. It doesn't matter what happens to the rest of my classmates, my friends. Whereas what these examples of change are showing is that it's not competition, it's cooperation. It's not the private individualization, but it's the commons. How do we do things as a collective? That becomes the important way of changing things. Then with happiness, the modern capitalist economy tells us that happiness is about going shopping. I think it's called retail therapy. Now, who really becomes happy is the one who makes the profits. But how do we actually become happy? By having these kinds of interactions, by having a tree outside my house, which I can learn from and talk to and enjoy, or having other animals around me, or other people with whom I can have good social relations. How do I have good clean air and good clean water? So happiness also has to be redefined. And finally, I would say, again, I'm not going into all these values, but for instance, we keep talking about human rights. And of course, that's important. But as important is the rights of nature. That every other species also has a right to exist and survive. Why should it be only human beings? In India, one of the most important principles that movements use is also, of course, non-violence. That we should not be violent. This is not just about physical violence, but also violent in our thoughts, violent in the way we speak towards other people and towards other species. So how do we generate non-violence? These are some of the kinds of values and principles that we have learned from communities in different parts of the world. And these are very different from what the current modern dominant system tells us, which is all about selfishness, fame, make more and more money, competition, etc. So let me end in the next 3, 4, 5 minutes by talking about the different kind of worldviews that are emerging. In India, we talk about Eco-swaraj. The word swaraj means self-rule or autonomy. But Mahatma Gandhi, when he spoke about it, he said Swaraj is not just about autonomy and freedom. It's about freedom with responsibility to everybody else's freedom. So it's not like the American way of life, which says, okay, my freedom means I can go and bomb Iraq and get all the oil from there. But it is that, yes, I will be free to do what I want. My community should be free to do what we want, but only if we also respect your ability to be happy and be free and autonomous, which means we have to look at our own consumption patterns. We have to live in a way that is much more responsible. So therefore, Eco-swaraj also is about extending that to the rest of nature. So this is a very simple idea that, like I said, everybody has or should have access to power, but it's power to do things in a responsible way. And so that is local direct democracy, or what we call radical democracy. And then the ecological aspect gets built into it. And if we do that, then the most important space for decision making is not the government, it's not the private corporation, it's the local community, the village, in the urban neighborhood, wherever our local communities are. Now, there are similar notions in different parts of the world. I'm sure there must be in Korea also, you can tell me. But for instance, in Latin America, many indigenous notions of how to live much more responsibly and with well-being as the most important thing, rather than money and fame and so on. Similarly, in Africa, in the one I know from Eastern Asia is Kyosai in Japan, many others from Europe and North America, and also new ones that are coming from within the industrialized nations, such as tea growth or ecofeminism, which are also fundamentally challenging the ways in which those societies have so-called developed. So moving out of COVID, we need strategies that are based on all these different kinds of transformation. I know that Korea, for instance, has been talking about a Green New Deal, and that's certainly better than what we've had in the past. But even the Green New Deal has a lot of faults. It doesn't fundamentally challenge consumerism, for instance. I read through the Green New Deal for America by Bernie Sanders, the former candidate for presidency. And it's extremely good in many different ways. But it, for instance, talks about replace fossil fuel cars with electric cars. Now, if every family on Earth needed an electric car, you would destroy the Earth by mining. So maybe the climate is improved, but mining destroys the Earth in ways, because electric cars can't be made out of thin air, right? So unless we fundamentally challenge our consumption patterns and the inequality between those who are rich and those who are poor, those who are currently powerful and those who are not, we will not be able to move out of multiple crises like pandemic without going back into the same old problematic ways of living. And so one of the processes we started a couple of years back to try and bring a lot of these movements from different parts of the world together is called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, the Tejida Global de Alternativas, which is trying to create a platform, a horizontal platform of learning, of sharing, of collaboration, of expressing solidarity, of creating more advocacy for policy changes, and also for collective visioning, or sort of thinking of what is the kind of society, or what are the kinds of societies that we want, in order that we can avoid the kind of crises that we are going through. The book on the top right hand side, which is available now in English, Spanish, and also in Italian and Portuguese soon, is a collection of 110 essays, including about 90 essays on alternatives from different parts of the world. The book on the bottom left hand side is from India, which is a vision of what India could look like in 2100. By 40 different authors on topics like gender and conservation and energy and health and education and so on. So it's kind of trying to dream an alternative vision and then come back down to current situation and say, how do we get to that kind of a alternative world? These books are all available online for purchase, or also available for free PDF download. I can put the links, I can send the links later to you. So let me end there. I hope that I have been able to convey some sense of the kinds of positive directions which people from all different parts of the world are taking. These are still very marginal, they're still very exceptional, and we need many more of those and networking amongst them in order to make the sort of large macro level changes that we need all across the world to save ourselves from the multiple crises that we are currently facing. That's my email ID. If anybody wants to get in touch with me later, please feel free to do so. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I wish the rest of the Congress best of success.
박수 부탁드립니다. Thank you, Mr. Kothari, for your keynote speech. It was insightful and alarming, yet very informative to us. In terms of assessing the situation, the environmental issues and situation in the mentioned regions, the alternatives and radical ecological democracy that you've introduced us are very intriguing possibilities that could come into play in the transition that the world now demands. Once again, I thank you for your keynote speech, and please allow me to translate this into Spanish. Expresamos nuestro más profundo agradecimiento al señor Kothari por su ponencia plenaria. Fue profundo y alarmante, pero también informativo, especialmente con respecto a los asuntos y situaciones ambientales en las regiones mencionadas. Las alternativas y la democracia ecológica radical que nos ha explicado e introducido son posibilidades intrigantes que podrían jugar un papel importante en la transición que el mundo ahora exige. Por favor, denle otra ronda de aplausos para el señor Mr. Kothari. 박수 부탁드립니다.
Thank you,
Thank you,
gracias.
Mr. Kothari. So long.
Bye-bye.
네, 여러분 이제 다음 세션으로 넘어가실 수 있겠습니다. 이로써 기조연설을 마치도록 하겠습니다. Con esto terminaremos la ponencia plenaria del señor Kothari. Por favor, procedan a las sesiones que les corresponden. Muchas gracias.
Recording stopped.